think we all have experiences where every so often some aspect of the spiritual path or our own personal life just all comes to a focus and everything seems to be talking about the same thing. A few days ago I started a new cycle with the morning broadcast that I do because I'd run out of whatever I was working on before. So I picked up the book that's called Affirmations for Self-Healing, which all of you know because every Sunday we read and do an affirmation from one of the 52 qualities because he has one for every day of the week. And we focus on Sunday on the affirmation and the prayer, and we read the little description that Swami has there, 3 paragraphs or so, small page, and doesn't even fill the page. And I've always known that those paragraphs were roadmap for right living, which is what I've called the program now. So I'm on quality number 2, which is 8 days later. Quality number 2 is love. Now love, of course, is something that is central to all of us. And however we talk about it or don't talk about it or conceive of it or feel it, it's the thread woven behind everything. And almost everyone, at one time or another, the heart feels like there could be more of it. So I was listening to Swamiji speak in the selection that we heard at the meditation. Not all of you were here, but in it Swami was saying that when he was visiting Ananda Ma, the joy-permeated mother described in Autobiography of a Yogi, Swamiji was very close with her when he was in India. She had a tremendous regard for him. And the way he put it was, when he was with Master, he was so young on the spiritual path and young in life experience that he was, as he put it, he was so much in awe of Master that he wasn't able to have the kind of relationship with him that a decade later he could have with Ananda Ma. He was just completely at ease with Ananda Ma. And so it drew him closer to Master because he felt in being able to be fully himself and close with her in a different way than he was able to be with Master. He was fulfilling that desire in his own heart. But in the context of what we were listening earlier, he said, Ma, there are many people in America who love you because of Master's autobiography and because of Swami's connection to her. There were many people in America who loved her. And Ma answered, all love is God's love. That was just her response. All love is God's love. And in the little paragraphs that Swami has written about love, he says the same thing. We don't experience love by trying to draw people to love us. We don't experience love by centering our love in other people. Love is infinite, and we merely open ourselves to be a channel for it. And that's all that we're trying to do, ever. But the gap between how we feel ourselves and what we think we need and what God really knows we need, I mean, that's the abyss that we're trying to get across as devotees. And by the grace of God, Swamiji has created for us the opportunity to live all the realities at the same time, Master came with this very interesting idea, which was community, where not just for monks and nuns, which has been around for centuries, but also where people could live in all the ways that our hearts long to live, with close friends, with romantic partners, with children that we can adore and raise, with work that is meaningful to us, with relaxation and interaction and art and friendship, all of these things, so that we can understand that all love is God's love. And instead of having it all taken away from us, instead it's given to us. And in Swami's exceedingly interesting life, in the early years, many of you know I've been doing this weekly class based from Light Bearer, in which I go year by year of how Swami made it happen. And I'm in 1988, and in 1985, Swami stopped being a monk and got married. Now it was just a dynamic incident in the history of Ananda. Then it was a cataclysmic event, because even though we were all just filled with all this involvement in the world, we expected Swami not to, because we had a very proprietary attitude toward him, which he didn't appreciate much at all. And we were all, but worse than that, we were all repudiating our natural inclinations in a false idea of what it meant to be spiritual. And Swamiji prayed to Master and said, I'm trying to make a community of householders and families, and what I have is, in 120 people, 60 of them are in the monastery. And of the 60 in the monastery, about 10 actually really belonged in the monastery. Everyone else was just trying to be spiritual. And he said to Master, what am I going to do? And he felt Master say to him, you could get married. And Swami said, sir, you made me a monk. And Master said, what difference does it make? So Swami just stepped out because he was not ever living for himself. He was only living for Master. And as things evolved, this beautiful, wonderful woman, Italian woman, came, and she was his wife for 7 or 8 or 9 years. And we all exhaled is the only word I can think of to use. It was like, oh, we don't have to try so hard to be spiritual, because all love is God's love. We can just live. And then Swami played the role of an exemplary husband for quite a few years. In the end, Rosanna was too strongly drawn to the spiritual life that she'd had in Italy, and it was too difficult to make the switch. And so eventually their marriage dissolved. But this is the drama that we're all living through. And then we come to what Lakshmi was reading at the end there, where Swami's talking about just having no interest in this world at all. That letter now, it's so interesting, because when these things happen, they had a very different impact. We had no idea that within a month Swami would be gone when he wrote that letter. Maybe it was just a couple of weeks. It wasn't very long. Of course, he was 86, and his health was terrible. And it took Narayani on one side and Shurjo on the other for him even to walk anywhere. I mean, he really literally couldn't walk except with one person on each side of him. It was only because of Narayani's devoted service and Shurjo's timely arrival on the scene that he was able to maintain as much as he did. So we couldn't have been surprised when he exited. But death is so extraordinary. We all know about it now. As I go through this life of Ananda, A lot of people in those pictures are not alive anymore. A surprisingly large number of them are not alive anymore. And guess what? Pretty soon we're not going to be either. And when the soul departs, it feels so big. And when Swami wrote that letter and just talked about, I don't have any enthusiasm, the hallmark of my nature has been enthusiasm, and I don't have any enthusiasm, I just want to merge into God. Oh yes, except the only problem is, I want to take all of you with me. And in another context he'd said, at one point he said he was never coming back. He said once he was gone, he was never coming back. That's when I said, having observed some appalling feature or another of early Dwapara, I said, sir, next time, please, let's wait till Satya Yuga. Let's not come back to another time like this. He said, I don't ever intend to come back. Very just like that. But later he said, like this, I know myself, he said. I'm going to have to come back for all of you. I said, but that's the only reason you came this time, isn't it, Swami? He said, and then he sort of looked just like a little like this, and he said, well, there is that, isn't there? All love is God's love. We think that we're seeking God or this or that, but then Swami writes in that letter, I love you. I mean, he's writing to hundreds, thousands of people. He was very, very honest. He never exaggerated. He never said anything that was untrue. I'm not exaggerating in saying that. He never used hyperbole. He never flattered us. He never just sort of laid it on with a trowel so that we would feel better. I only saw him do that once, actually. One time, he just praised this woman to the skies. And I thought it was a little more than was warranted. But shortly after, she was drawn away from the spiritual life. And I realized, he was just trying to keep her. Because being important and appreciated was something that she would respond to. But with that single exception, I never saw him exaggerate even an iota. So when he says, I love you all, I read that letter countless times and heard it repeatedly. I love you all. How could he love us all? He didn't even know all of us. But then he adds, but I don't particularly love your worldliness or your desires. That's what we would bring. We would bring, but I want this and I need that and this is so hard for me and how will this ever work out? And I'm lonely and I'm unhappy and I'm unhappy because I'm married or I'm unhappy because I'm not married, whichever way it goes. Just like we just bring this whole pile of us. And Swami just so casually says, no, I'm not really very impressed with all of that. That's not what I mean when I say I love you. What I love is that we are one in the Spirit. What I love is that when I look at you, I see the shining power of the divine in there. Early on in his life as a monk and a minister, Swami would explain that he started, every time he would see the audience, whoever they were, he would speak to Master inside of them. He would lecture to his own guru. And some of his guru bhais said, how can you presume to lecture to your own guru? And that doesn't seem like he was just a young man. How could he be teaching his master? But what Swami meant is he was speaking to the presence of the divine in everyone, and he was calling it to come forth. That's what he loved. When he looked at us, what he loved was, he even said this, and it was such a beautiful way to think about it. He said, whenever I see people suffering, I think, how much more glorious then will be the moment when all suffering ends in God realization. And so instead of going into that suffering and allowing it to define his concept of us, he just saw it as the thinnest veil over our eternal bliss. And our eternal bliss was what was going to come. And then he writes, in whatever else was being read, oh yes, in that letter he wrote to a friend, he said, when I die, I expect Master to ask me one question. Even that was, you expect Master to ask you one question, and that question Master will ask is, how much have you loved me? I mean, it's sort of like, I wrote that book, so I know what's in there. I know that letter. I know that whole letter. I know the whole context. And I know I contemplated it at the time, but tonight I was feeling it like, how did he know that's what Master would ask him? And especially when you think of all the things that Swamiji had to do, and all the trials he had to face, and the ups and downs of his own life, and, the drama. And Master, he felt at the end of it, Master wasn't going to ask anything except, how much have you loved me? And then Swami answers, you are all I have ever loved. And then a few of us would want to say, but what about me? But all love is God's love. And in loving the Guru, we're loving God. And in loving God, we're loving everything. It's so simple and so difficult. This is the paradox of the path. We think it's complicated because it's not easy. And then we spin it endlessly. Well, in my past life I did this, and then so-and-so did that, and then I compensated by doing this, and now I feel like this, but sometimes I feel like that, and then, then we have this word, this popular word, that things trigger us, which they do, just like a gunshot going off. And we can become so enamored in all of that for a while. But then the point comes when it just, actually that's the word. The word for it is anguishing monotony. At first it interests us, and then there's an anguishing monotony to it. And it just becomes, there's just only two options. Either we love God, or we worry about ourselves. Or we want love, but we want it this way or that way, or maybe this way, or a little bit of that, and then a little bit more of this, and then some of that. But if all love is God's love, and if it's infinite and it's there for us to have at any point, what holds us back? What holds us back? Swami was brilliant in ways that were, easy to see in his writing, his music, his singing, listening to his voice. Oh my, what a voice. My, that man could sing. What a voice. And, but his intelligence was his fearlessness, because he didn't care about all the little delusions and all the ups and downs. He just loved God through it. And as a consequence, he loved us. And more powerfully than that, he does love us. Masters, realized souls, moksha, free souls, they don't go away. When Swami died, and I've had this image before, but it's so vivid in my mind, I wasn't present. I always assumed I would be present. I always assumed that we'd get notice and we'd all congregate in whatever country he was in, and there would sort of be this long goodbye. Like Ramakrishna died, there was a very long goodbye. The disciples were there for weeks and weeks before he passed away. But Swami, it was like the phone rings. Swami's having trouble breathing. I get a call from Devi. It was 11 at night. was like 8 in the morning in Italy or wherever they were. They were in Italy, but something like that. Davy says, Swami's having trouble breathing. I said, Davy, what does that mean? She said, I don't know. I said, that's the only message I have. 15 minutes later, Kirtani calls and says, Swami is free. Just like that. I mean, that was how much time we had like this. Later, all the stories were told. I wrote it up, and Narayani, who was there, Swami looked right into Narayani's eyes and then stopped breathing. So she was there. You can read it in the rest of her book. And it was cataclysmic in our world. Just the end of an era, the end of everything. Not really, but yes. When it was interesting, long after Swami moved to India, or after Swami moved to India, there was a satsang in his house there, and I was there. And Shivani asked Swami a question that no one had ever asked him before, as far as I know. I think Swami held it at bay. She said, what was it like for you when Master died? And Swami was very interesting because he was very open, but every so often you'd somehow cross some line of propriety that you didn't know was there. I did it a few times. It's not pleasant when you do it, but I did it. I asked him something. Mostly I asked him anything and he answered me, but every once in a while I'd ask him something he didn't want to answer. So Shivani asked that question, and Swami turned to her and said, that's a very personal question. Shivani is, of course, marvelously impersonal, and she's utterly oblivious. She's utterly indifferent. Swami gave her the supreme compliment. She loves being corrected, is what he said about Shivani. He also said it to me because he knew very well that I didn't. I accept being corrected. I'm grateful eventually, but I did not love being corrected. Shivani loved being corrected. So he said, that's a very personal question. And so then everything goes silent because nobody knows what to do. Swami's sort of looking at the ground like this. Then he said, it was heartbreaking. I'd known Swami more than 40 years at that point, and it had never actually penetrated into my consciousness. He was 26 years old, or not quite 26. He was about to go to India with Master. 3.5 years. He thought they were just starting. And then all of a sudden, just like that, it was gone. One of the reasons as I've thought about this for a long time, what if Swamiji had made us feel that something was lacking because Master was no longer with us? What if he had made us feel that the death of the Master is actually a loss? How would we ever have come to what we've come to? Swami did nothing for himself. Even something as deep and as personal as his relationship with Master, he gave it to us only in the way that would help us. There was nothing for himself. That's what love is. We think love is somebody tells us that we're pretty and, keeps us company and sympathizes with our little problems. It's nice. I like it too. Everybody wants that. But all love is God's love. And the only thing God wants from us is freedom. That's all. So when Swami stopped breathing, it was the end of an era. That's all. But it wasn't the end of him. And even as I tuned into it, and this came to me very strongly, because it was Saturday night when he passed. I woke everyone up. We all went into the temple. We were there for a few hours, our little temple at the community. We were there for a few hours meditating and just talking. And then about 4:30 or 5, I went back to my house and I went to bed. I was in bed about 15 minutes when I realized it's Sunday morning. We can't just go up and give an ordinary, this is the reading for this week. It's like, so then I just got up again and had to think about what kind of a Sunday service do you have when Swami just died? And we had to do all of that. And then it occurred to us that we should go to Italy. So we got tickets, and the next morning we flew, or maybe that night. No, the next morning. And I realized how everything had changed at the airport, because I have, in 1987, I moved from Ananda village to this place, Palo Alto. And from that point, I never lived in the same community as Swami Kriyananda. For the first 16 years I did. Most of the time I lived next door to him and saw him virtually every day. Then all of a sudden I lived 200 miles, then 10,000 miles away. But always either he would come to where I was, where we were, or I would go to where he was, multiple times, countless times. And often it was to Italy, to Europe, to India. So it was a big trip. And it would be like, we were there. And as soon as you would land, you'd just go to the next step. It was just a beeline to where Swami was. So now all of us are converging in Rome from India. Because we were in Italy, from India and America. People are converging, and we sort of all knew who was coming, and people were arriving at different times. I think we were one of the early arrivals. We ran into whoever we ran into, Nakulu and Nishala and Dharmaraj. I don't even remember exactly. But it was like we were just sitting in a coffee shop, like for 2 or 3 hours, just while all of our friends just arrived. It was very dynamic because there was no place to go. There was just no place to go. There had always been a place to go, and now there was no place to go. The odd thing about that, you see, it was poignant and painful and extraordinarily liberating. Oh, everything is the same now. Everything is God's love now. Because the one point in the material world where it was focused has dissolved. But Swami hasn't gone, just that point has gone. And this is the picture that came to me. Swami had this enormous consciousness. What am I saying? He had a limitless consciousness. That's how I felt him in November of 1969 when I first saw him. It was just limitless. There was no end to it, and it was always the same. But it came out of this tiny little thing which was his body and his mind, like that. And then that closed. And none of the rest of it, which was infinite in scope, none of it was touched. But this tiny little bit closed. And that was sort of the feeling sitting in that coffee shop, which was something enormous and nothing has happened. And he is free, as Kirtani said to me. And so are we. Swamiji interestingly said once, it's easier for you to relate to Master never having met him during his lifetime, because you can always feel him as infinite, and nothing contradicts that. And of course that's true for Swamiji, if we choose to. But he doesn't care about all our little desires. And so to open ourselves to that, we have to risk that on the other side of all that littleness is something that we really want, and that it's worth the price. That's the spiritual path. And he's Master's instrument, and he'll take us there if we want to go. The choice is ours.